Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A new podcast which examines many important people and the important things in their lives, what they think about most current trends at the moment, what they think about certain subject matters, and of course, what their ideal world would be. As part of a special series covering the Tiverton and Honington by-election, today's guest is Frankie Rufolo, who is running under the For Britain Movement banner. He has previously run for the party in local elections in the Devon region, where he is based, numerous times since 2019, as well as attending several protests concerning the likes of Brexit, Hong Kong, and scrapping the BBC licence fee. So, yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Yep. The first question I wanted to ask you in relation to this was that, hypothetically, you've just been elected as the MP for Tiverton and Honington, and you've just entered Parliament for the first time. What is the first major policy that you try to that you seek to achieve while there, and who will you work with in order to achieve that goal?
Well, Neil Parish was trying to get the so-called levelling up funding for things like the redevelopment of the Seaton seafront. And there are a lot of transport issues in Devon, like Cullompton doesn't have its train station, which has been promised for years. The Cullompton Relief Road has been promised for years. And there's a big problem with big trucks and lorries going through the narrow streets of these small mid-Devon towns, and it causes damage, it causes bottlenecks and traffic problems, and causes a lot of worry for pedestrians. So just trying to get that funding that he's put in jeopardy with his foolish actions and trying to sort out those transport problems. And also, fairly hard on the priorities would be the TV license fee, scrapping the TV license fee, because there's an aging population in East Devon, and they are now being made to pay the TV license fee as well. And they were promised by the Conservatives they wouldn't have to pay for it, but now they are being made to pay for it. And some of the programs these days, there are still some good ones, but some of them aren't so good. It's a load of politically correct, crude, vulgar nonsense, a lot of it. And I think, you shouldn't have to pay the TV license fee to watch other providers. It's like me going to the shops to buy the Tiverton Gazette and being told, Frankie, in order to buy the Tiverton Gazette, you have to buy the Guardian, or just open a free newspaper that you get through the door, and being told, oh, in order to read this, you have to pay for this newspaper. So I think it's one of many policies that we have, one of many small tax cuts we could make to help ordinary families save money and to help them get by in the cost of living crisis. Obviously, we've got to cut taxes on energy bills and VAT and so on as well. But the TV license fee, there have been so many broken promises, and we're all talking about energy at the moment. I think it's worth bringing it up. And I'd work with other Devon MPs. I work cross-party in order to try and bring about the changes that Tiverton and Honiton needs.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, one of the first times I actually met you was during the Make Britain Great Again BBC rally, which was quite interesting. But on that, briefly, the BBC stuff, how do you feel about Nadine Dorris's recently announced plans that she plans to freeze a license fee? Do you think that's just essentially they're going to follow through on that, or is it just going to be, let's throw some road meat to the benches to stop us kicking Boris out over whatever controversy is in this month?
Yeah, I mean, we see this happen every so often. Somebody in the Tory party will talk about scrapping the TV license fee or freezing it, like you say. But it's just, this gets brought up when the party is a bit divided over the national insurance rise or on whether or not Johnson should stay at the moment. And it's just to try and please the Tory backbenchers, a few Tory voters, as they're not doing so well in the polls. But you've got to believe it when you see it. And like I said, there've been broken promises on the TV license fee recently. And Nadine Dorries, she's more in with the people than some other politicians, but she doesn't exactly scream competent.
Fair enough. And one of the things I wanted to ask was that what got you first involved in politics in the first place, or to use the colloquial term, what was your red pill moment?
It was gradual, really. There's not really one so-called red pill moment. I think in the EU referendum, I wasn't old enough to vote at the time, but I was listening to the arguments on different sides, and I sided more with the Leave side, and a lot of my family voted Leave. And I was really cross at the main left-wing parties, the extra Labour Party, the extra Green Party, the Lib Dems, of course, who were all against enacting the result. I didn't trust the Conservatives either, because Theresa May was a Remainer, and it took them years to get it done. There's still an issue with Northern Ireland. So the referendum was one thing. When I was at the same time, we were all leaving secondary school. We were talking about going to college and university. I started learning and finding out about this safe space culture on campuses and the censorship and the problems of political correctness gone mad. And part of me thought, oh, it's just some crazy fad that will come and go in America. But then I went on this sort of camping trip with lots of other people my age, and the people there saying that there are more than two genders, and this is causing silly arguments, and it sort of made me think, okay, it's a real problem here as well. And it's just a hobby, just watching videos about this in my free time sometimes. But it was I think it was partly working in a homeless shelter that made me want to get angry at the world and injustice in the world, and made me want to do something good in the world. And also, afterwards, all the terrorist attacks that we had, my local librarian and very good friend, his mother was on London Bridge hours before the terrorist attack in 2017. So you don't have to live in somewhere like Luton for it to affect you and people you know and to care about it. And going to all these anti-terrorism rallies, Anne-Marie Waters really inspired me, and I joined For Britain. And later on, she sort of inspired me to start standing for elections. Yeah.
Anyway, but one thing I wanted to ask you on that is that you talk about joining For Britain and all these anti-terrorism rallies. Yeah. Your party, if you don't mind me saying, is explicitly an anti-Islam one. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
What's your party's problem with Islam, especially given that it's the second largest religious faith in the country next to Christianity, at least according to the 2011 census?
The problem is that, look, I'm an atheist. I have no horse in this race. And, I've always been, since I was a kid, really, a sort of Stephen Fry or Richard Dawkins type atheist. But it's like Bill Maher, that American talk show host, says that all religions are, even if you see all religions are bad, you can notice the problems that Islam causes in the real world. We've got a massive problem with FGM in this country. It's been going on for decades. It's been illegal for decades, and we've had appallingly low prosecutions for it. Yes, it predates Islam and it happens in African Christian communities, but it's encouraged in Islam. It's a problem across Muslim communities. We've seen with all these Islamic terrorist attacks, that's where the biggest violent threat is coming from at the moment. There aren't as many, I don't see as many Christian terrorist attacks. All of the countries where blasphemy and apostasy is punishable by death, they're Islamic countries. Nearly all of the countries or parts of countries where death sentence for homosexuality is still on the books, they're Islamic countries or Islamic regions of that country. So Islam, Anne-Marie Waters, she started off the National Secular Society, and she's spoken out against the Catholic Church. And, there have been some appalling things that have happened in other religions, of course. And I was brought up in the Methodist Church, and there's been some scandals there. But Islam, it causes repetitive, disproportionate problems. We know it's not all Muslims, but it's too many Muslims doing these things. And they are, at least in part, inspired by the religion and the scripture and the ideology. So yeah, it's just I'm a critic of Islam, but a friend of Muslims.
Okay. And how do you feel about the fact that recently it was exposed, I think in The Guardian, actually, funnily enough, that there was a report I think it's coming out or is out, the Shawcross report, which has noted that they've criticized Prevent, the supposed counter-terrorism stuff, of focusing too much on far-right extremism as they see it, and not enough on Islamic extremism. And apparently some of the money that goes to Prevent went to the Taliban, according to this report. How do you feel, what does that speak to in terms of the state of our security services at the moment, that they're overly focusing on one thing and not the other when it seems disproportionate?
Yeah, I've seen the headlines. I haven't read enough about this full report to have an opinion. I didn't know about the money going to the Taliban bit, although I'm not surprised. We've seen this with the foreign aid budget. I think you're right. There has been a disproportionate focus. I don't think there has been a massive increase in far-right extremism or far-right terrorism. I just think that after the terrible murder of Joe Cox and that man who drove a van into a crowd of Muslims outside a mosque. It was a terrorist attack. We called it a terrorist attack. I think people are just taking it more seriously rather than that real particular threat getting significantly bigger. But yeah, it's like with Rotherham and the J Report and all these other towns up and down the country. It's political correctness. People won't challenge or criticize Muslims for fear of being called racist or some other kind of bigotry, even if somebody from that minority is actually in the wrong. And it's like with the Manchester Arena attack. It could have been prevented, but the security guard there, one of many failings, was the security guard who didn't challenge the suicide bomber for fear of being called racist. So it would seem that the Prevent program, unfortunately, has gone the same way after all these years of Muslim groups like Cage, the Muslim Council of Britain, MEND, pushing this false and harmful narrative that this optional counter to extremism program is somehow persecuting and oppressing the Muslim community. And it's not. I have experience with Prevent, and it's just counter speech. It's just challenging people with potentially extreme views, and it's generally a good thing.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on this front is that I remember reading a thing about Douglas Murray actually called it, I think it's Rowleyism, essentially. He said in The Spectator, where he noted that there's this sort of conflation with far right extremism and Islamic extremism. They're somehow compatible in terms of like the threat they pose to the country, and it seems like this is reflected all over popular culture. If you look at a show like No Offense, or I think it was Trigger Point that was released recently, which had all this stuff in there. Is this part of the same sort of thing where essentially they're trying to whip up hysteria about people far right terrorism on the rise? They can shut up their critics pretty much, like we're seeing in the States, you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, after the Finsbury Park mosque attack, the BBC had to apologise to Douglas Murray himself because somebody from the Muslim Council of Britain was on one of their programmes and compared Douglas Murray to Anjan Chowdhury, which is just ridiculous. And, we've seen with, I think, with the Buffalo shooting in America as well, this terrible white supremacist extremist who went into a supermarket and killed several black people, or a dozen people, because they were black. Some people on the left will use this to attack everyone they don't like, even if they're not listening to what this terrorist is actually saying. I understand the argument that we shouldn't listen to what this person says if you put out a crazy manifesto which would go in the rubbish. But if they're saying they hate mainstream conservatives, or they don't mention Tommy Robinson as someone, it's a bit unfair to blame an attack like that on all these other mainstream people. And it is a false equivalence. I mean, whenever people have criticized Islam for being homophobic, there's often someone who goes, "Oh, but what about the Westboro Baptist Church?" And it is desperate stuff. This false equivalences all the time.
Mm-hmm. And one final anecdote on that is just very funny, to me at least it seems, when the left accuse people on the right of politicizing stuff when it comes to, say, grooming gangs or Islamic terrorism. But when they do oversay something like Grenfell, that's apparently perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to them to dance on the graves of people, but not fine when anyone challenges them on anything. But beyond that,
with the Grenfell Tower tragedy, there's a real there is a real fight for justice there. And it was a tragedy that could have been prevented. I mean, when Boris Johnson was mayor of London, he shut down 10 fire stations, and after all these 70 people died because they were poor, it is unforgivable. But you're right in that they have a sense of it's okay when we do it. When we speak out after a terrible atrocity, we're exploiting a tragedy. We're exploiting the deaths of these people. When they speak out, if they're campaigning for justice and they're doing the right thing, or they're telling the truth. And so it's hypocrisy. It's okay when we do it.
And hopefully the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire, hopefully will get justice as far as this inquiry goes. Anyway, the next question I wanted to ask you was that in the past, during an LBC interview that you did, or like a debate you did, you called for Britain a slightly more left-wing, slightly more radical alternative to UKIP. Now, putting aside the whole fact that UKIP is not as much of an electoral juggernaut as it was even back then, explain how that pans out and what appeal such a party would have in the constituency you're running in.
Well, we believe very strongly in the NHS, and UKIP certainly some key prominent figures in UKIP, like Paul Nuttall, always flirted with the idea of completely privatising it. And the way I see it, if you want private health, if you want to go private yourself, that's fine. But the NHS, it's been going for years. It's generally a good thing. And it's a good thing that people in this country never have to worry about big, high medical bills. And, people in this constituency, particularly the East Devon part of it, it's not between the Tory and the Lib Dems. It's not between Tory and Labour. It's between the Conservatives and the East Devon Alliance. Basically, anyone in if you're really lefty in Devon and you can't get in a part of Devon where you can't get elected as a Labour Party person, you stand as an independent, or you stand as a Green or a Lib Dem, and you form these sham residents associations like Cranbrook Voice, Newton Says No, Local Independence for Tiverton, and they get together. But it's it shows that people are voting for alternatives to Labour and the Tories. And one thing they campaign on a lot is healthcare, adult social care. And here in Tiverton and Honiton, here in Devon, you've got 1 in 8 people in Devon are on an NHS waiting list. The Southwest has some of the highest suicide rates in the country. Devon has some of the worst dental care in the country. My sister's a midwife up in Barnstaple. We've got a shortage of midwives, as is a problem nationally. So if you want a party that is anti-EU but pro-NHS, that is common sense, is not politically correct, but at the same time cares for the rights and the interests of ordinary working people, that will raise pensions, that will ensure there is a welfare state that is a safety net for the vulnerable, not a hammock, then it's for Britain.
Mm-hmm. And following on from that, in your announcement page about your candidacy on For Britain's website, you noticed that last year's county council elections, you gained more of the vote than other populist parties like aforementioned UKIP, Reform UK, and the Heritage Party. In short, what can you offer the right wing and independent swing voters of Tiverton and Honington that those parties cannot, beside the Tories?
Well, for Britain, we're part of an alliance of parties across Europe. It's called the Identity and Democracy Group. Personally, I preferred it when it was the Europe of Nations and Freedom Group, because that's what we stand for, and we're working with other Eurosceptic parties across the continent against the European Union. And the people of Devon, of Tiverton and Honiton, overwhelmingly voted to leave the European Union. So this is a chance to elect a real Brexiteer, a real Eurosceptic to fight your corner, someone who respects your vote, because the Lib Dems did not respect your vote. And it's also new and modern, and we've proven that we can win elections and we can get elected. Oh, sorry, I've got something beeping in the background there.
That's
but we've had breakthroughs in local elections before, and we can make significant gains here in Devon this time. It's someone with lots of local knowledge as well. So the UKIP candidate, he's from Stroud. Stroud is a long way, or is it Stroud? But it's a long way from Devon. And likewise, the Heritage Party, they're not talking so much about local issues. So it's someone who, I'm not just a British nationalist, I'm not just a Brexiteer, it's this local patriotism.
Mm-hmm. And on that same announcement page, and you alluded to this earlier, you are heavily critical of the online harms bill, warning that it would, quote, regulate the internet and take away our liberty, our privacy, and our freedom of speech online. So to spell it out, what are the main problems with the proposed online harms or safety bill, whatever it's called these days? I don't know.
Yeah, they seem to keep changing the name. The problem is that it's so broad and vague that it's open to exploitation. And the Tories, it's like the police crime sentencing and courts bill. There are so many different things, so many different issues sort of lumped together in this one piece of legislation. So they talk about when I say broad, and it's broad and it's vague, they talk about tackling so-called harmful but legal content. I mean, I think most people would agree with social media websites, internet providers getting rid of things that are promoting stuff that's actually illegal. Obviously, get rid of indecent images of children, of course. But what is who decides what is harmful but legal content? You've got talk of content that causes mental or emotional harm. what's that? Can a trans person say that J.K. Rowling's tweets cause them mental and emotional harm? Can Muslims say that ex-Muslims speaking out against their religion on social media are causing them mental and emotional harm? Who decides this? And we've also got Nadine Dorries making the announcement of an Orwellian disinformation unit. This is quite literally a ministry of truth. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic with Ofcom and other social media companies trying to control our conversations about COVID and vaccines. And we've seen this from the Labour Party as well, saying they want to ban anti-vaccine content. Well, what is anti-vaccine content? Is it someone like me who's vaccinated, who helped other people get vaccinated, but who's just dead against COVID passes or vaccine passports or vaccine mandates for care workers and health workers? How can you control disinformation when the official information is constantly changing, whether it's on the United Nations saying that the World Health Organization rather saying there was no human-to-human transition, whether it's the flip-flopping from governments and government experts about how effective masks are, because the Advertising Standards Authority actually banned the promotion of masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus. The Wuhan lab leak theory went from being considered disinformation, being a conspiracy theory, to something that the World Health Organization and many people are considering to be a real possibility. So the government shouldn't be censoring the internet in this moral panic about misinformation. People are not stupid. People can listen to all sorts of different things and make their own judgment.
Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, on the lab leak stuff, I remember when I was at Politolite, anyone scared to smack a gun on it, and we were attacked quite a lot by these so-called anti-hate groups. I think Rachel Riley attacked us as well, and I don't think any of those groups have apologized, but they never do. One minor thing I must ask is that, what do you think that the Conservative Party now, when they claim to be, pro-freedom of speech when it comes to college campuses and so on, are trying to get legislation passed, which, if, would, for instance, if a Labour government got in, we'll probably see people being arrested for making Diane Abbott mass jokes on the grounds that it's racist or something. Why do you think they're doing that? Are they just legitimately that, can't see the wood for the trees, to be polite about it?
I think, like I say, it's like with the TV license fee. The Tories say one thing and then do another. And I think, this free speech on universities and that, it's when it sort of suits them to having to do something to push back against the newly lefties on campuses, because we saw Jacob Rees-Mogg's speech at university being almost violently disrupted. That crowd of people who went in shouting and screaming, and it caused a bit of an argy-bargy, a bit of a physical fight even. And so I think the Tories will try and push back against those people and try and protect free speech at universities. But at the same time, they want to appeal to some of their, let's say, old-fashioned or easily offended voters by going after Jimmy Carr for making offensive jokes. Nadia Whittome, a Labour MP, tried to change the broadcasting law in response to Jimmy Carr making an edgy joke on Netflix. And Nadine Dorries actually spoke out against Jimmy Carr and said this isn't comedy. And Boris Johnson actually spoke out against Jimmy Carr. So it does make you think, the Tories might actually censor that. They're pro-freedom of speech when it suits them, which isn't really pro-freedom of speech. If you don't believe in free speech for people you hate, fear, and despise, you don't believe in it at all.
Yeah, and they're more likely to defend someone like Angela Rayner, someone who called them scum, than freedom of speech when it comes to comedy, which probably tells you what you need to know, I suppose. Anyway, Another thing I wanted to ask you is that, what are the biggest issues that get raised on the doorstep when you're campaigning, or just, when you're campaigning locally?
I think police and crime issues have come up a bit. While no one's disputing that Devon is a relatively safe part of the country, but we still have a problem with rural crime, with tractors and probably GPS tracking systems and things getting stolen around Axminster. You've got the sheep rustling. It's gone down, but it's still a bit of a problem. But there's been a 20% increase in sexual offences in Devon in the last year. We had a 50% increase in domestic abuse in Devon during the lockdowns. And I think that crime, it's so difficult. It can be so difficult to come forward and report. There should be as many ways to help people do that as possible. So reopening the front desk at Honiton Police Station and making sure the same thing happens sooner rather than later at Tiverton Police Station would be a top priority of mine. Having grandchildren in 3 years because of the lockdown, because of the pandemic, because of all the travel restrictions. So we're not moving on from Partygate. Boris Johnson is a lying hypocrite, and him and his staff were laughing in the faces of the British people while we were suffering and struggling to get by during the lockdown.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that this might be indicative of is like, why do they still stand by this whole narrative? It seems to me of well, lockdowns have worked, have been really good and stuff like that. When it's pretty much seems that every single one of the people in charge didn't follow their own rules, whether it be Neil Ferguson, whether it be Dominic Cummings or whoever it may be. Like, why do the mainstream media still follow that whole narrative if no one in charge seems to have believed it, including both both leaders of the two biggest parties in Parliament, it must be said.
Well, all of them, Ed. I mean, there were Sinn Féin politicians in Northern Ireland saying we've got to have all the same restrictions as the Republic. We've got to have a really strict lockdown, and they broke the lockdown rules by going to a massive IRA funeral. The SNP in Scotland have been very strict, but then of course you had that SNP woman Margaret Ferrier who travelled around knowing that she had coronavirus, who's probably the worst of the lot, and she still hasn't resigned as an MP. To Neil Parish's credit, he resigned very quickly. But back to what you were saying, yeah, I mean, they had all the Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock had the top scientific experts, the top scientific advice. Boris Johnson had the personal experience of having had coronavirus himself. He was hospitalized with coronavirus. And yet they still thought they could have affairs or have big parties knowing all of that. We should have had that choice as well. We should have been able to do that too. And like I say, make our own minds up rather than having politicians and bureaucrats micromanaging our lives and penalizing people for trivial things. I mean, there was a family in Ottery St. Mary who had the police turn up because their teenage daughter had one friend round for her birthday, and this was within the rules anyway. Somebody in Exmouth took a photograph of a really rare bird. I don't know much about birds, but this is a good picture. And lots of bird watching enthusiasts from outside the area who were driving to this town in East Devon, and the police were turning them away and saying, no, you're giving them fines because it was breaking the lockdown in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on this front is that, was it? How do you feel about the fact that it seems like no one in the UK, in terms of politicians, have resigned over this? Given that even in somewhere like Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, about 2 years ago, there was a thing involving, I think, like a golf party or something like that, or a golfing trip, and everyone at the government at least apologized and resigned over violating their own rules. Why do you think that actually none of these people really apologize for, having been caught with their trousers down, so to speak? Is it just because they're so vain?
Well, with Matt Hancock, that was quite literally being caught with his trousers down. But I hate to contradict you, Ed, but Matt Hancock did resign, and Dominic Cummings went eventually. I think Boris Johnson, he's shameless. He's a gambler. He's a survivor, and he's managed to buy himself time. So a lot of all the Tory MPs defending him went, "Oh, we must wait and see what comes out in the Sue Gray report." And now we've had police investigations, we had the report out. They're saying, "Oh, it was a long time ago. We've moved on now." So it's the government. They've got no one's priorities at heart. They've got no principles. All they're concerned with is clinging on to power, and they'll lie and they'll defend the indefensible in order to do that.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel about the fact that it seems that we live in a state now, at least seen through the COVID lockdown and stuff like that, of which there's an American writer called Sam Francis. He noted that there was something coming to play in America, which he called anarcho-tyranny. The idea essentially that people were not, essentially the authorities wouldn't regulate people's lives in their own private sort of confinements and doing stuff like hate speech and whatnot. But when it comes to actual laws, they're a bit reluctant to enforce them. Do you think that's increased since sort of lockdown, especially with the rise of the managerial state? And why is that the case, do you think?
I think part of it is political correctness. I mean, the state will come down on you like a ton of bricks if you're having a few beers in the pub during the lockdown. I mean, the police were going into pubs in North Devon because to check if they were breaking the substantial meal rule. When that was in place, it was that ridiculous. But at the same time, you saw in Glasgow that protest that stopped those illegal immigrants from being deported. I think there was a similar protest in London recently. You had these Black Lives Matter protests where they tore down, the police just stood back and watched them tear down a statue. And then, of course, those same people in that same city, because they're not taking the police seriously, they rise up and cause a massive riot last year. So they've allowed, it's politically correct policing. It's the selective application of the law. All the anti-lockdown protests, they were broken up, and the people involved in those, like Piers Corbyn and so on, I don't like Piers Corbyn, but he has a right to speak and a right to protest. They were punished. But Black Lives Matter protests, the police were literally on their knees, and all the Labour MPs and people who've been supporting the lockdowns were out with them. And you also have the NHS staff who were on strike, who were having a protest about their wages, and they got fined too under the lockdown rules. But it's like with, again, it comes back to Rotherham and all that. It's political correctness, I think, is a big part in this, in the selective application of the law. And some people think they can get away with anything and do some pretty awful things. And I think that's an interesting phrase, actually, anarcho tyranny. I think that's where we're going.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on that is that what is it? Do you think, on the last thing on this, actually, I wanted to ask you about was something that someone like Peter Hidges has proposed at the Mail on Sunday column is that people all of these people who've been fined should have their fines, waived and given their money back. Do you think, for the sake of, unity and moving on from these incidents, that's what should happen?
Well, when I first heard about the Partygate and everything, and the guy I mentioned in North Devon who was fined for having some beers, having some drinks, and having a small party with his workmates, went, I want my £100 back. At first, I was thinking, no, like we should just give Boris Johnson a really big fine. But he's only been given a 50 quid fine. I mean, I'm not as nearly as rich as Boris Johnson, but even for me, like a 50 quid, that's not more than a slap on the wrist fine. I could have probably afford that. So for such a rich man like Rishi Sunak, he's on the rich list, and he only gets fined £50 for breaking his own COVID rules. So part of me thinks, yeah, actually, if the police investigation, it's finished now. We're not going to waste more money investigating the Prime Minister and all his government colleagues, because we know what's happened. Although I think there might have to be an internal investigation into the Met for their reluctance to investigate this initially, and their how lenient they've been with the Prime Minister. But yeah, I do sympathise with the argument that everyone should get their COVID fines back, and I think we should consider it. I think I've always been we've been a lockdown skeptic party from the start. I kind of fell for it at first, like the COVID press conferences with the experts, they looked good. I thought, what, let's just listen to the experts, let's go along with this, we're going to be all right. But of course, that's not what happened. We had all these scandals in the care homes with COVID patients being discharged into care homes. But I think rather than locking down the economy, what the government should have done is lock down the borders. It's been quarantining people coming into the country, testing people at the airports. Like America's COVID response was bad, but Trump's travel ban on China brought them some valuable time, and we should have done that as well. And if it had just been that, and also if you're actually spitting at people or coughing at people deliberately, doing stuff like that would be unacceptable and out of order under normal circumstances, then the state should come down on you like a ton of bricks. But other than that, we should have been allowed to live pretty much normal lives and trusted people to take their own precautions, rather than having this full, devastating, over-the-top lockdown like we did.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on that, if you don't mind me asking, is this is a different question, is that given how the city you're running in is a safe Tory one and has been since 1997, which is as old as I am, how do you plan to win over such voters to your side?
I think with some of our policies, like on lower taxes and cutting taxes, like scrapping the TV license fee, like we're against the national insurance rise, which has rather annoyed a lot of Conservative voters. again, we're a lot because people are very angry about Partygate. It's good to know that they can vote for a party who were lockdown skeptic pretty much from the start. And also, we're a pro-Brexit party. We're an anti-EU party, so we'll win over some of those Tory Leave voters. And we're against mass immigration because in Devon we've got a bit of a housing crisis. We've got all this building on our lovely green land and our countryside, and locally, second home ownership is a big part of the problem. But nationally, one thing that's a big factor in driving the housing crisis is, of course, immigration. The Conservative governments keep missing their immigration targets. So how can you solve the housing crisis if we don't know what the demand for housing is going to be from one year to the next? So dealing with immigration and protecting the countryside, looking after animals, supporting British farmers, protecting our fishing communities. We've got some coastal fishing communities in the Tiverton and Honiton constituency. They should be protected from EU boats, whether they're fishing illegally off the coast of Devon, which happened earlier in the year, or if the governments are actually giving them licenses, giving them permission to keep fishing in our waters, these big EU super trawlers. We've got to stand up for our fishing and farming communities and for all the good, decent people in Devon towns, historic Devon towns like Tiverton and Honiton and Seaton and Columpton, and giving them the tax reliefs they need, the tax breaks they need, and the transport and infrastructure that is needed in their communities.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on this front, I hope you don't mind me asking, is that ignoring, besides Tractorgate and Porngate, whatever the hell it is these days, how do you feel about Neil Parish's performance as an MP in this constituency? And what were his strengths and weaknesses that you would take note of if you were to take over his position?
Well, it sort of takes me back to Brexit a little bit, because Parish was a Remainer, and he sort of reluctantly got behind the idea of leaving. But this by-election is a chance to vote for someone who thinks like you, who really believes in what Tiverton and Honiton voted for. And also Neil Parish, he spoke out against cuts to foreign aid. And for Britain, we support cuts to foreign aid because, this money, some of our programs have done more harm than good. So when people were encouraged to donate their old clothes to African countries, what happened was that the people who were weaving and making clothes, who had their own little businesses there, they ended up out of business and they ended up in the slums as well. And so when we give them things, it dilutes the economy. And when we give them money, it's inevitable that some people will misuse that money. And foreign aid money has ended up swindled by corrupt bureaucrats, swindled by brutal foreign militaries, and it's even fallen into the hands of terrorists. So in the Middle East, obscure groups like Nur al-Zinki were getting hold of the money, and also you had this civilian police we were paying for, I think in Iraq or Syria, who were working with, the police we were paying for would close the roads so that ISIS could carry out public executions. It's awful. It's a real scandal, and this is other people's money, and the Tories, the so-called Conservatives, will tinker about, merge one department with another, and for Britain, we're just like, no, we've got to make it, this is other people's money, we've got to make it stop. And on top of that, by scrapping the foreign aid budget, we will be able to invest in more money in Devon's communities. You're in Axminster, people are telling me there aren't enough local shops. And if we were investing in Devon, we would be able to, the local authorities would have more power, more financial means of lowering the local business rates, to have a local economy, to have good jobs for local people.
Mm-hmm. And one thing on that, if you don't mind me asking, is that what would you say to critics of that sort of idea who would say, well, if we pull out, China's going to go back in and start putting in money anyway? So how would you counteract that sort of that line of thinking if you're keen on gutting the foreign aid budget?
Well, for Britain, we're an anti-China, anti-CCP party. Our policy is to punish China for the COVID pandemic. And also, there are so many things China needs to be punished for. What they do, the genocide they're waging against the Uyghur Muslims, the brutal crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, Britain's last major colony, and many people there still feel British, still believe in this country. You know, it's not just the Kaifeng Jews are being persecuted. The Cardinal Joseph Zen, the former Archbishop of Hong Kong, he spoke out against China for persecuting the Christian minorities there. China is very anti-gay. China has to be punished, and one way of doing that, well, there are certain companies and corporations involved in the genocide that should be banned, in my view. But we would create tax incentives to get those corporations to pull out of China and bring some of the manufacturing back home, back to Britain, because Axminster is famous for Axminster carpets. But there are lots of other places where we could create good manufacturing jobs for local people in Tiverton and Honiton. And I think also helping this country compete with China, education is very important. So Tiverton High School is getting very crowded. It's a problem all the main parties are talking about. And of course, the lockdown has massively set back children's education and well-being and their mental health. And what we would do is not only increase education spending, but we properly support the grammar school system and help the brightest working class kids in towns like Tiverton have an opportunity for an education that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson take for granted. And a new grammar school in some of these Devon towns would really help them excel academically, while kids who've been set back by the lockdowns and everything that would have more focused support to help them catch up on their learning. And that way we can take on China in an intellectual war of ideas, in terms of science and technology, in terms of just having a thinking, smart, educated population.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to say specifically like us taking out foreign aid from a lot of these countries, how would we stop, say, a country provisionally like China moving in and just essentially them getting essentially them dominating the land through that way? How would we be able to counteract that if our money's not going in there?
Well, if we punish China, they'll have less ability to do that. But also, again, Brexit. The European Union was not good for our relationship with the rest of the world. The common external tariffs hindered Britain's trade with the rest of the world. The common agricultural policy, it wasn't so good. It wasn't perfect for farmers in Devon. It was also criticised for undercutting poorer farmers in developing countries. And Brexit is a fantastic opportunity to help people abroad through trade, not aid, and create good jobs and things. Help give these poor countries a hand up, not just a hand out, like communist China might be planning on doing. And that way, we'll forge strong relations abroad. And again, this is a chance for people in Devon to vote for someone who really believes in what they voted for.
Mm-hmm. And on the subject of China, if you don't mind me asking, how do you feel? And Paul Embry, the trade unionist, has done a very good article on this for Unheard. How do you feel there's sort of this cynical alliance when it comes to China with sort of like a lot of toadies, whether it be between sort of like the old school, I guess you'd call them tankies on the left, who defend it for ideological reasons, and weirdly enough, neoliberal types on the right, people like Philip Hammond, who around anti-Chinese sentiment within the Conservative Party and all the rest of it. Yeah. How do you feel about this being this cynical alliance at the heart of much of Western culture, where a lot of people admire the Chinese state, and which seems to include people that say far left outlets and even people like Mike Bloomberg? How do you feel? What do you think that speaks to in our modern world?
It's a bit like with immigration. The left support it for ideological reasons and to try and bring in the hopes that we'll get them some new Labour voters or whatever. And also the Tories and some people support it for their own corporate, their own business reasons. They think of immigration purely in terms of economics, as people's economic units. And they just want that supply of cheap labour for their own big business interests. So I imagine there are people. I don't imagine it. There are people in the Tory party with big dodgy business links to China and other despotic regimes. So Rishi Sunak's father-in-law, his big business still provides IT services to the military regime in Burma, which of course has China's support. So it's to do with, I think, some left-wing people, they can't see past this. It's a communist system. It's their idealist system. And they'll turn a blind eye or sort of deny something like the Uyghur genocide or what happened to people in Hong Kong. I've had arguments with people about this. I was at a protest in a while ago against the police crime sentencing courts bill, and there was a lady there who was like, "Oh, but China, they lifted so many people out of poverty." And I'm like, "Yeah, but they don't have any rights." could have a big protest like this in China. It didn't end too well in Tiananmen Square.
Mm.
It's like some people reckon that the reason why Jeremy Corbyn hasn't been as tough on Russia is because why he's a bit of a Putin apologist and why he's defending Russia so much is because he's nostalgic for the Soviet Union and he can't see past that. And it's sad. It's like banging your head against a brick wall trying to deal with these tankies who are still defending communist China because it's communist and they don't want to let go of this outdated, evil ideology.
Mm-hmm. And one thing on that is, this is only going to be one question on this subject because we're going to have a whole hour on it, funnily enough. And I've already done something on it, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. How do you see it ending in the long term? And does it really? How does the same? Yeah. So how do you see it ending in the long term? If you don't mind me, asking, the whole Russia-Ukraine stuff.
I'm not an expert on the matter. I think Putin. There are thousands of Russians who've been protesting against Putin's pointless war, and I support those people. And I don't like Putin or Zelensky. I support the Ukrainian people who are defending their country and the Russians who are protesting their people being killed needlessly in this wasteful regime change war. And we can only hope that Putin's generals and other people around Putin turn on him. And you see him sat at the end of these massive tables on his own or away from his advisors and other people. And you do start to think, or maybe he is paranoid, or maybe there are actually people in Russia conspiring against him. How do I see it ending? I don't know. It could be very. It's already very awful in the meantime. Russia is killing, maiming, and raping the people of Ukraine. And not only that, but Putin's actions have made the whole world a more dangerous place. People are more worried now about China invading Taiwan, while all eyes have been on Russia and Ukraine. North Korea has been breaking sanctions and testing weapons. And you've got all these, with this militarization and centralization of Europe, that could change a lot of things too. So Ireland, Irish neutrality, by staying out of all the big wars like Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, the Irish have been able to send peacekeeping troops abroad to help out in African countries. Austria, they're not heavily involved in these sorts of Western regime change wars, and they play a big part in trying to negotiate peace deals with Iran. So all of the peacekeeping work of all these European countries, that might have to be sacrificed in order to unite against Russia. So hope with all the chaos and all the terrible things Putin has unleashed, I think he may well have brought about his own downfall.
Mm-hmm. One quick anecdote on this: there's a great film of Nicolas Cage that came out nearly 20 years ago, which is about, funnily enough, the post-Soviet world, called Lord of War, which is, I think, probably quite relevant to what's going on in Ukraine, just because it's very good at explaining the cynicism of war, which people should watch. I'd check out, I think. But anyway, one other thing I wanted to ask is that you've been involved in, and I'm not sure it's around quite a lot of protests within the local community. Do you think that might be one thing that would increase your local appeal? Mainly the fact that that people might recognize your face from a lot of these protests beyond just campaigning and being a local man in general.
Yeah, and I think it's. I go to all sorts of protests, and they know they've got someone who's active all year round, who doesn't just turn up at election time, and who talks about the politics of Devon just all over, and also Neil Parish. One thing he was known for was turning up and meeting all the people from the Boxing Day hunt in Tiverton. You won't see me there. You'll see the anti-fox hunting protests.
Mm-hmm. And on that, talk about protests. One thing that you did, if you don't mind me bringing this up, was, if I'm like, didn't you burn a Quran once during like a debate or something?
Yeah. This is a long time ago now. This is a few years back. But it was during a heated argument in a pub with some students of the university, and they were effectively saying, "Oh, Frankie, you should respect Islam. You have to respect Islam." And this was just my way of saying very clearly, no, I don't. And it's defending freedom. I know I'm not advocating, I know the connotations of it, but I'm not advocating that the Quran or anything be banned. I'm saying that we have a right to speak out against this religion and ideology. And there are people all over the world who are being punished, who are being killed for doing so. Raif Badawi was being persecuted by Saudi Arabia until very recently. And we're seeing this across Islamic countries. Look at the school teacher in Batley and the other school teacher in Colchester in Essex. The teachers' unions did not stand up for those people. Groups like the Muslim Council of Britain kept very quiet for a while, as they did when the school protests were happening in Birmingham. We need an anti-Islam party in this country. Nearly every country in Europe, it has a party in its parliament that will criticize the ideology of Islam, apart from Britain and Ireland. And for Britain can be that change.
Mm-hmm. And this is the last question I'll ask you on the whole burning thing. Is that, if you don't mind me asking, how is that sort of helpful to the conversation you want to have on Islam as a whole? If you don't mind me asking.
It was just, I think sometimes you do have to be a bit provocative, and sometimes you do have to be a bit controversial. And the local media sort of went through my through all my Facebook and everything to try and find some sort of gotcha, some headline grabbing story, and this was what they got. This is a one-off, but I think it's to make the point that it's the Quran I have a problem with. It's the religious scripture, it's the ideology that is the problem, whereas the people are individuals, and whether they choose to act in that ideology or not is another matter. So it's making the distinction. Islam is not Muslim people. Islam is it's the Quran, it's the Hadith, it's the Muhammad, it's the ideology, it's the organized religion.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on this, and forgive me, this is a bit of a long-winded question, don't worry, near the end, is that do you think we're talking about the cynical lines between sort of like the left and the right when it comes to China? Do you think one of the reasons that radical Islam is not taken as perhaps as serious as it should be is for a similar reasons? Because on the left you have fanatics like Chris Harman, who in 1994 wrote The Prophet and the Proletariat, where he said, with the Islamists, sometimes with the state never, advocating Marxists could work with Islamists on the idea of what do you call it? Essentially for progressive purposes. Or you have cynics like Jack Straw, who a Muslim commentator actually in The Guardian noted in 2005 wafted someone into the House of Lords in order to court the Muslim vote in his area. And meanwhile, on the right, you have people like Theresa May, being too afraid of being called racist, so she attacks Lewis Smith for joking about prayers, or people, and these people benefit from mass immigration and so on. Yeah. Do you think there might be that cynical alliance for that reason, that a lot of profitable apple carts might be overturned if something like that happens?
Yeah, and I think it's also a matter of that there's this idea that an enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's not always the case. So the left sort of see Muslims as through the lens of race, and they see them as this oppressed minority that they've got to help, even though a lot of Muslims would happily oppress other people if they could. The majority of Muslims in this country think that homosexuality should be criminalized, and I'd be very interested to know what they think the punishment should be. And we see this with these school protests in Birmingham. A lot of people on quote unquote our side of politics were supporting those protests. Nigel Farage, actually, this is one of the problems I have with the Brexit Party and Reform UK. Nigel Farage mentioned those Muslim parents in an interview as if he was taking their side. And these are not decent, reasonable parents objecting to politically correct nonsense being taught in schools. These are deeply bigoted people. You see them outside saying, no, it's not okay to be gay. These protests were taken over by Hizb ut-Tahrir, who have a big presence in Birmingham, who support the death penalty for homosexuality. It's way too extreme. And they were saying, they weren't saying, we don't want this stuff because it's not age appropriate or because it's confusing children. They were saying, we don't want this stuff in our schools because it's not Islamic. And anyone cheering on these Muslims who are protesting outside a school in Birmingham, or if anything similar happens in future, be very careful, because this sets a precedent. If they get their own way, then it sets a precedent for more Islam in schools. And we're already seeing this right here in Devon, where there's this group called Devon Development Education who go into schools teaching children about multiculturalism, and some of it's perfectly harmless, like teaching them about different foods, but some of it, like getting girls to try on the hijab, that's not good. That comes across as indoctrination and very much a one-way street. Would they go into schools and ask Muslim girls to take off the hijab and do your hair in dreads as if they're Jamaican, or try a French plait to integrate. They wouldn't do that. It's all going one way.
Mm-hmm. And another thing on this quickly is that how do you feel that it seems in recent years that any time there's sort of an Islamic terrorist attack, the thing is buried very quickly in the news the next day, whether it be I think it was the 2020 Reading stabbings. I think it was on New Year's Eve 2019. I think it was London Bridge again or Westminster Bridge. I can't remember which. Or the murder of Sir David Amos. Do you think that? Why do you think there is when it's like when it's revealed as Islam as terrorist, it gets buried in the news? There's that Family Guy joke where he has the thing where it's a bunch of like skin tones. It says this is terrorist, this is not. Do you think it's sort of like that in a way?
I don't know. I mean, you get the sort of reaction that's the we've got to talk, we've got to worry about Islamophobia. We can't have any Islamophobia. I was speaking to this. I was like in my teens. I was about 18. I was talking to this girl who lived around the corner from me. I used to work for her mom, and she said, "Oh, we've been taught about terrorism in school." And I was like, "Oh, really? What do they teach you?" And they went, "Oh, we taught about Islamophobia." I was like, "Oh no!" But it's indoctrination, and there's a bit of a moral panic. But I think white people do get called terrorists rightly when they're committing acts of terrorism. National Action, that neo-Nazi idiot group, they're a prescribed group now. They're a banned organisation now. It's official. It's on paper. They're a terrorist group. But white people do get called terrorists when they are involved in acts of terrorism. There's a lot of talk about Northern Ireland at the moment, and a couple of years ago, you had the terrible murder of Lyra McKee. And no, of course, the IRA are mostly white, and nobody says that they're not terrorists or doesn't describe them as terrorists. You had the Finsbury Park mosque attack and the man who murdered Joe Cox. They might not be able to convict them of terrorism on some technicality, but it was described as terrorism in court. So I think the lefties' narrative that the minorities are treated unfairly, or these different shooters or whoever are treated differently, I don't think it holds much water. I don't think it applies these days.
Mm-hmm. And this is the final question on this topic, and then we'll just go to the last couple. Back in 2017, a couple of years ago, Counter Jihad, which I think is the appropriate name for the sort of the ideology that your party keeps, if you don't mind me saying, was sort of like a zenith because you had Douglas Murray's Strange Death of Europe come out. You had your party being set up, and Brexit seen as sort of one of the catalysts of that was the response to stuff like this. Do you think if you won in this by-election or did significantly well, even it could sort of like start a resurgence of the movement, which seems to have been slightly dormant over the last few years? I hope you don't mind me saying.
Well, I think we could actually. If we were to do well, if we were to win, it would be a huge boost for our party. And it would, like I say, we're part of an alliance of parties across Europe, so it would be encouraging as well. I mean, Chega, the party in Portugal, led by a man called André Ventura, it's relatively new, and he came third in the presidential election. So we can come a long way in just a one-off election. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the final question on the main series of questions is: if you lose this by-election, what do you plan for your political future?
Oh, just keep going, keep fighting the local elections, or even if we don't win, you've got Mid Devon District Council, East Devon District Council, and Exeter City, all the rest up for election next year. So it's just a matter of getting the party active, getting our name out there, and then more people may vote for us next year on a local level, and that's where we can start making change happen, where it's fighting these developments and all these buildings happening on our green land, where it's stopping these rises in council tax, whether it's the local councils are talking about housing more and more so-called refugees, but housing more Syrians and Afghans, when actually we should be putting our own people first and helping the homeless people in Devon and veterans in Devon, and all the people in squalid, substandard housing. You've had houses with terrible damp and mold in Devon. You've had care leavers. We've got a real problem with child social care and adult social care at the moment, where young people leaving care have ended up living on the streets in tents, and that is a failing of Devon County Council, and it's absolutely appalling.
Hmm. And the penultimate question I wanted to ask you, and this is the title of the show, so I ask everyone who comes on, what would your ideal world be?
My ideal world, it's well, it comes back to that group we were part of. I've like preferred it when it's called the Europe of Nation and Freedom. That's what I envision. Having free and independent and democratic countries. I think I've got a small list of countries that shouldn't exist, and Ukraine's not on it. Sorry, Putin, but China's quite up there. Pakistan, I want Baluchistan to be independent from Pakistan. I'd love to see Hong Kong reunified with Great Britain. Um, I want to see, I believe that international cooperation is possible without these huge, overreaching globalist bodies like the European Union, like the United Nations, and have the people of countries electing politicians with their best interests in heart, and doing the right thing for them and going their own way, rather than having us all going one way with the European Union, with the United Nations, to thing similar to what you described as anarcho tyranny. I want a safe but democratic, a free and democratic world where people, broadly speaking, can live as they like, and where we're not still dealing with all these terrible human rights abuses like we see in Islamic countries, with slave labor and with genocide that's going on in China at the moment.
Hmm. But anyway, thank you for coming on. And
Thank you.
if people wanted to find out more about you and your campaign, where can they find you?
So I'm more active on Facebook than anything else. My public Facebook page is at Frankie Ruffalo Devon. It just comes up as Frankie Ruffalo. I'm on YouTube and Instagram as well, and on Twitter. Just type in Frankie Ruffalo. You should be able to find me on there. And my email address, my For Britain email address is frankieruffalo@forbritain.uk. So if you want to get in touch, maybe get involved in the campaign later on, we'll definitely you can give me a shout that way. And some of the local media are taking an interest. They're saying they want to give all of the candidates equal coverage. So keep an eye out in Devon Live, Mid Devon Weekly, all the local media that will be covering this by-election.
Hmm. Okay, that will be all. Thank you for coming on, and enjoy the rest of your day. Good
Thank you,
luck in
Ed.
the election as well.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the Ed Interviews YouTube channel, and also the Ed Interviews BitChute channel, and also look at my stuff on Mixcloud as well. I have more of this content coming in, and also subscribe to my Patreon subscribe star as well for more guest requests, as well as free copies of my old books. Until then, see you next time, guys.